Thank you, Sherry, and the worship team for leading us this morning. It's great to see you all here today on this kind of a dreary Sunday, right? Those of you who are online, we're glad that you're worshiping with us as well. We are in a series that we just began last week called Living as Exiles. Two things I love about this series. One, the theme of living missionally or living our lives as missionaries is one that I'm very passionate about. John King calls it my stump speech. And secondly, this series gives us the opportunity to really focus in on some characters in the Old Testament particularly that are some of my favorites. Last week I had the opportunity to talk about Joseph. Today I had the opportunity to talk about Daniel. Before we go on, could we cut the center lights some? They seem much brighter than normal kind of in my eyes. If we could lower those a bit, that'd be great. As we talk about exiles, everybody's looking at the lights now, right? When you hear the word exile, what comes to mind? For me, exile brings to mind someone who lives in a place that isn't their home. Exiles aren't necessarily refugees, but there's some similarities. Exiles may have been forcibly removed from their homeland because another nation has taken over their country, or someone may be in exile because it's dangerous for them to remain. Perhaps they've been being hunted by someone, or maybe they've committed a crime and are trying to avoid being imprisoned. Exiles don't really belong in the place where they live. Their freedom is limited, and power and control have been stripped from them. And so you might be saying, okay, if exile has those kinds of negative connotations, why would you choose to label this series Living as Exiles? That's a great question, and I'm glad you've asked it. In the Bible, God's people frequently lived as exiles. In the Old Testament, the Israelites spent 400 years in Egypt. We talked last week about how they got there through Joseph, who went down to Egypt, ended up staying with his extended family for 400 years. Later, God's people were exiled to places like Babylon and Persia in the Old Testament. In fact, much of the Old Testament is written with the Israelites, God's people, living in exile. And in the first century, when the New Testament was written, God's people lived under the oppression of the Roman Empire. The words exile or exiles or inexiled occur nearly 150 times in the Bible, mostly in the Old Testament. But the concept is also present in the New Testament. We're going to look at that in a little bit. As I was thinking about this idea of exiles, though, last week, I had a kind of a disturbing revelation or disturbing thought. While none of us wants to be an exile, and we prefer, every one of us, being in control of our lives and having freedoms, we often don't handle comfort and security well. Let me explain that to you. A quick survey of the Old Testament illustrates this. It was often when God's people were most secure, most comfortable, most in control and in power, that they succumbed to pride and blatantly disobeyed God. And I think if we honestly assess our own lives, we'll probably see the same pattern. When things are hard and we're struggling, it's natural to turn to God in our weakness and say, God, we need your help. Can you come and deliver us? We need you to meet with us. We need you to work in this situation. We do that because we know we're unable to help ourselves. But when things are going well for us, we become enamored with our success, and we tend to easily lose sight of God and our need for Him. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but any of you identify with that? I mean, I think that's really human nature, and I think we see that played out in the Old Testament, and if we look closely, we see that in our own lives. Think about Jesus' church in our world. While we celebrate the many freedoms in this country, including religious freedom, and we'd fight to hold on to it, the church in America's relationship with God could probably overall be best described as complacent, prideful, lethargic, and maybe even anemic. And meanwhile, in places like China, India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, where religious freedoms don't exist, the underground church is thriving. and the faith of individual believers is vibrant. Now, none of us desires persecution, and I'm not asking you to pray for that, or having our religious freedoms restricted. But if we're honest, we have to acknowledge that faith in Jesus often thrives in less than ideal circumstances, like being forced to live in exile. New Testament writers like Peter, Paul, and John understood this truth. In his first letter that the Apostle Peter wrote, 1 Peter, he addresses his readers as, to God's elect exiles who are scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And while Jesus doesn't use the word exile specifically, the idea comes through clearly in his well-known prayer in John 17. I want you to listen closely to these words, part of his prayer, verses 13 to 16. Jesus said, I am coming to you now, but I say these things while I'm still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within them. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world, any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Listen to the exile language. The world has hated them, for they are not of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Whether we like it or not, or whether we want to admit it or not, as followers of Jesus, you and I are living as exiles. We live in a temporary place while we await eternity in our permanent home. And so the question for us is, how do we live as exiles? Fully engaged in the world in which we live, while recognizing there is so much more beyond this life. And if I could fully answer that question for you in a way that we could all understand and live it out, that would be miraculous. Because that's the dilemma, really, that followers of Jesus have faced ever since Jesus walked this earth. How do we live in this world as people for whom this world's important and we're engaged in it and we want to be involved, and yet we're exiles who recognize that ultimately this world isn't our home, that the things that are here are passing away and they're not eternal. During this 4-week sermon series, we're exploring the lives of the Old Testament characters Joseph, Daniel, Nehemiah, and Esther. And they were all God's people, Israelites who thrived while living in foreign nations, and those nations worshiped anything and everything but the one true God. Now, I intentionally use that word thrived because these 4 people rose to prominent position of influence as leaders in pagan countries, while also remaining true to God and maintaining their allegiance in Him. Last week we looked at Joseph's life, and today we're going to look at Daniel. And as we examine Daniel's life, I want to specifically highlight traits I believe are crucial for us as exile. In fact, I want to list them for you on the front end so that you can kind of keep them in mind as we walk through Daniel's story. As we seek to faithfully live as exiles, we can learn from Daniel's focus, or his perspective, his tact, his humility, and his integrity. Focus or perspective, tact, humility, and integrity. There's a lot of traits that I could probably pull out of Daniel's life, and yet, as I looked at his story again in the passage that we're going to look at today, I believe those 4 are really critical for us to grab hold of as we seek to live as exiles ourselves. I'm going to give some commentary on Daniel's story, but Daniel's story is really pretty clear-cut. And so there are some passages of Scripture that really tell it better than I could, and so some of this, I just want to read what we learn about Daniel, because it just tells it very clearly in the Scripture. I'm going to begin by reading verses 1 through 7. of Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, king of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. And so there we have the story of how Daniel lands in Babylon, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who we're not going to touch on much today, but they have a really interesting story as well that kind of unfolds alongside of Daniel's. In that first verse, the information that we're given allows us to pinpoint when this took place. These events happened in 605 BC, nearly exactly 600 years before Jesus was born. And without getting too deep into the weeds, the Babylonians ruled Israel for approximately 45 years, and then the Persian Empire overthrew Babylon and ruled Israel beginning around 539 BC. Now keep the Persians in the back of your mind, because they play an important role in Daniel's life later that we're going to touch on. The Babylonian strategy when they subjugated nations was that they thought they could get the nation to be more compliant if they pulled out some of their best and brightest young men and took them to the foreign capital and trained them in the ways of the Babylonians, and then had them help to give rulership over their people. And so kind of figured, hey, people will be much more on board with what we're doing if we allow some of their young men to be in positions of leadership throughout the empire. And so the Jewish young men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were transported to Babylon, where they lived as exiles. And we see from those first verses that the ones who were taken were from the royal family and nobility. And so Daniel, we don't know anything else about his family, but Daniel was a person of nobility and royal birth. I mean, he was a privileged young man who was taken along with his friends to Babylon. I pointed this out last week in Joseph's story. It's so easy for us to read these stories quickly and lose sight of the deep emotions of the people that were involved. Daniel and the other young men, probably in their mid to late teens, were uprooted from their homelands, taken from their families, and dropped in a city and culture that was completely foreign to them. They were given new names, they ate new foods, were given new clothes, taught new ways, heard new languages, and were encouraged to worship different gods. I think it's hard for us to imagine the culture shock these guys experienced. Most of these young men probably weren't thinking about their faith in God at that point. After all, hadn't God abandoned them? Wasn't God responsible for their nation being defeated and for them being taken to another city 1,600 miles away? Faith in God, I'm guessing that for most of these young men, probably took a back seat to trying to stay alive and make the adjustments that they needed to make in their lives. And yet, we're about to see that that wasn't the case for Daniel and his friends. And I'll pick up reading at verse 8 to verse 17. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Daniel's resolve to remain faithful to God, even in these challenging circumstances, is noteworthy, very noteworthy. While most of the other exiles probably felt like they had no choice but to go along with what the Babylonian officials said and the program that they were given, Daniel sought to remain true to his values and true to his God, and he looked for another option. And so this is where I'm really struck by Daniel's tact walking through this situation. He understood that his request might not be granted, and he didn't have much leverage as an exile. Rather than demanding his own way, he asked for permission, and then when the official expressed his reservation that Daniel and his friends might not look as healthy if they ate vegetables and drank water, as opposed to the royal food and wine that the others were going to partake of, Daniel said, let's try a test. How about for 10 days, you give us water and vegetables while these other guys eat the king's food and drink the king's wine, and we'll see who's healthier. At the end of the 10 days, and the official agreed to that. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego looked healthier than the other young men, and they were allowed to eat the diet they had requested. And then we read in that last verse that in response, God gave them all kinds of wisdom and knowledge and the ability to interpret dreams. I love Daniel's resolve and focus, his ability to maintain perspective, and it really is pretty convicting to me. I started to think about this late in the week. I thought, how did we do during situations that happened surrounding COVID at keeping our perspective and our focus? I think the challenge for any of us is when things happen that kind of rock our world, it's easy for us to lose sight of our place as exiles and begin to react and respond like everybody else. Because we lose sight of the bigger picture, the perspective of who we are as God's people. And yet Daniel, in the midst of his uncertainty and fear and homesickness, kept his focus on God and continued to live faithfully. I also appreciate the tact that Daniel showed in approaching the guard responsible for him and his friends. Daniel could have made demands. He could have done a hunger strike or threatened all kinds of things. Instead, he asked the guard to grant an exception. And when the guard expressed some reservations, Daniel proposed a test. He stepped out in faith and he asked God to come through for him and his friends by giving them greater health than the other exiles. God not only gave them greater health, in response to Daniel's resolve, he gave them wisdom and discernment and understanding and the ability to interpret dreams. My observation is that as followers of Jesus, we often struggle with maintaining tact when it comes to trying to live out our faith as exiles in a world that can be hostile to us and our beliefs. We're quick to make demands and threats that put others in an uncomfortable position rather than treating people with courtesy, respect, and tact and allowing God to work in our behalf. And here's where I really want to sit on this for a bit, because I think this is really important. I believe when we take matters into our own hands and we use threats, or we say we're going to sue, or we say these are our rights, When we cling on to that, we essentially put God off to the side and say, I'm going to work this out for myself. I know I'm right. I know I have whatever behind me. I'm going to pursue this and get what I want through these channels. And we essentially, when we do that, push God off to the side rather than allowing Him to work on our behalf. As we get back into Daniel's story, I want us to see something that I pointed out last week with Joseph. Daniel's story here that we're looking at today is compressed into 6 chapters. It seems very quick. We read about him going into exile. We read about his objection to eating the royal food. We read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And then in chapter 6, we read about Daniel in the lion's den, which we'll talk about in a few moments. It's in 6 chapters and you could read it in 10 minutes. But I want you to understand something. Approximately 60 years, 6 decades, occurred between the start of Daniel 1 and Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Daniel lived faithfully in the Babylonian Empire and later in the Persian Empire from the age of approximately 15 to 17 until he was well into his 70s. And through it all, he maintained a posture of humility and integrity that's impressive. And I think as we think about those traits that I mentioned of humility and integrity, again, understand we're not talking about a couple weeks, a few months, or a couple years. We're talking about 6 decades, 60 years. Look at Daniel's humility and integrity just through a few snapshots. In chapter 2, we read about a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. None of the wise men could interpret it. The king was so upset by the ineptitude of his wise men that he said he was going to have all their heads. He was going to kill them all. When Daniel learned of that, he sent word to the king and said, hey, I think God can interpret your dream. Listen to the humility that Daniel exhibited when he came before the king. The king asked Daniel, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Just like I pointed out with Joseph last week. Joseph had every opportunity to elevate himself and say, hey, I'm your man, Pharaoh. You got a dream? I'll interpret it for you. Because I'm wise and I can interpret dreams. Daniel had that same opportunity, and that kind of hubris, that kind of pride would have been well received by the king, by King Nebuchadnezzar. But in humility, Daniel said, hey, it's not me that's going to interpret your dream, but there is a God in heaven who can interpret dreams. Daniel refused to take credit for himself, and he humbly pointed to his God as the only one who could accurately interpret dreams. I get excited just talking about this. I think it's so inspiring and honestly convicting to see how Daniel was able to walk. In chapter 5, we read about some strange writing that mysteriously appeared on the wall during a banquet. And again, no one could interpret the writing. The writing troubled the king, and no one could decipher it. And finally, Daniel was called, and he comes before King Belshazzar, another king at this point. And the king offers him fine clothes and jewelry and said, I'll promote you to the 3rd highest ruler in the land. Daniel says, you may keep your gifts for yourself. Give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. And as Daniel interpreted the mysterious words, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but in his interpretation, he gave glory to the Most High God. And then that brings us to Daniel chapter 6, probably the story or the mini story that we know better than any other about Daniel. He's thrown into the lion's den for his refusal to stop praying to his God. In the first verses of chapter 6, we're introduced to a new ruler, Darius, king of the Persian Empire. So he started out the Babylonian Empire. Now we're 6 decades later, and it's the Persian Empire, the world superpower at that time. Amazingly, Daniel is still in a position of influence. And again, I think we tend to gloss over it and just kind of read the story and go, oh, that's interesting. That would be like our Secretary of State serving for over 50 years, and then staying in power after our country was overthrown by a foreign power. Like, that doesn't happen. Daniel's an Israelite. He's at a position of leadership in the Babylonian government, which in itself is pretty amazing. The Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians, and Daniel's still in a position of leadership. That's amazing. It was only by God's orchestration that Daniel was able to maintain that influence. Most, if not all of us, are familiar with the story of Daniel being told he couldn't pray, but he continued to be faithful by praying 3 times a day in front of his open window. Sometimes I think of that, I think, Daniel could have prayed in a closet, right? Like, he could have laid on his bed and prayed. But it says he just kept doing what he'd been doing. He went to the open window, he faced Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day. As a result, the king, who had been tricked into making a law that would ensnare Daniel, had no choice but to throw him into the lion's den. Daniel was thrown into the lion. The king stayed up all night, was fretting over it, but God protected him by closing the lion's mouth. It's a great story, and if you haven't read Daniel or don't know his story, take about 20 minutes and read Daniel chapter 1 through 6. Last week's assignment was to read 14 chapters for Joseph. Took a little longer. You've only got 6 this week. And it's raining out. I mean, what else do you have to do? I know, it's the first day of the NFL, but you can read at halftime. Read the story. It's amazing. Listen, what's really fascinating to me, though, is the background for how Daniel, this plot was put together that ended up having Daniel thrown into the lion's den. And again, we're focused on his humility and his integrity in this part. It pleased Darius the king to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. He's going to be number 2. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find ground for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. I just want to pause. 60 years they had to try to uncover all of his conversations and decisions that he had made and all that, and they couldn't find anything. In 60 years. That's amazing. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, I love this, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. We can't find anything to pin on this guy unless we can figure out a way to make his devotion to God a crime. And so they went to the king and said, hey, king, we think you're so awesome. Everybody should worship you. We just think it'd be a really good idea if for the next 30 days you made a law that everybody in the kingdom has to worship you. Well, the king's like, well, I'm glad you think I'm so great. That does sound like a good idea. Let's make a law that everybody has to bow and pray to me for 30 days, and he signs off on it. The satraps understood that Daniel would keep doing what he was doing and that they'd be able to ensnare him. So Daniel, like always, goes and prays. They go back to the king. They say, hey, Daniel did this, the king then realizes what he had done because he loved Daniel. And, we know that God delivered Daniel. Daniel's success stirred up jealousy and envy among the other rulers, but they couldn't find anything to pin on him except his faithfulness to God. Again, that's extraordinary. In serving in high political office for nearly 6 decades, and his rivals couldn't find any dirt. The only way they could think to trip him up was over his committed devotion to his God. Daniel's example of how to faithfully serve God while living in exile is exemplary. As a young man of maybe 16 years of age, he displayed focus and resolve to be faithful to God while his world was being turned upside down. And then over 60 years of serving God in a foreign government, he embodied humility and integrity. There's so much that Daniel did well, and there are more godly characteristics of his that we could draw out, but I want to focus specifically on his focus and perspective, his tact, his humility, and his integrity. And I'd like you to consider these questions. They're going to go on the screen, and I'm going to ask you in a moment then as we close to really focus on these questions and allow God by his Spirit to speak to your heart. God, what is it in my life that you would really like to bring to my attention as I think about Daniel's life and compare myself to his? And so I'd encourage you to prayerfully consider these questions. First, how do I give priority to my relationship with Jesus and living as his faithful follower? And it's not up there, but how do I do that when it's easy to be distracted by all the things going on around me? How do I give priority, no matter what's happening, to my relationship with Jesus and living as his faithful follower? And are there steps I can take to strengthen my focus? Just encourage you to meditate on that and allow God's Spirit to speak to your heart. Secondly, how does Daniel's tactfulness speak to me? How can I grow in placing my trust and faith in God rather than relying on my own ability to protect myself and to make things happen? I think for many of us, when that tact and being respectful falls away, is when we feel like we're threatened. And out of fear, we say, I need to exercise my rights. I need to take this situation by the horns and control it myself. And yet we see in Daniel his ability to place his trust fully in God and say, I'm going to act tactfully and respectfully to those in authority over me and trust God to work in this situation. So how does Daniel's tact speak to me? How can I grow in placing my trust and faith in God rather than relying on my own strength to make things happen? Third, how can I embrace the humility and servanthood of Jesus? Specific to this story, how can I embrace the humility that Daniel represented, that he displayed? And then the fourth question, are there gaps in my integrity? Are there steps I can take to ensure that I walk faithfully and honestly before God and before people? I don't have to tell you that the number of pastors, Christian leaders, Christian business people who have fallen morally or abused power over the last number of years seems like it's constantly in the news, constantly in front of us. I think if we were able to kind of explore more deeply, we'd recognize integrity gaps. We'd see compromises that were made. Somebody doesn't just live life in a perfectly faithful and integrous way and then suddenly have a dramatic fall one day. There are steps that are taken along the way. And so that question, I think, is really important. Are there gaps in my integrity? Are there steps I can take to ensure that I walk faithfully and honestly before God and before people? And so I've asked us those questions about focus and perspective, tact, humility, and integrity for each of us. And as you process those questions, I want to encourage you to consider taking tangible steps this morning. I want to invite the worship team to come up. I understand that all of us can make decisions at our seat. Nobody has to know. Those can be really powerful. But there are prayer people along the side. There are prayer benches here at the front. Perhaps you want to just kind of step into the aisle or come to the front as we sing, as a sign before God to say, God, you're tapping into my heart about one of these issues. I'd like to acknowledge that and just submit that to you and pray that you would work in my life. And again, you can make those decisions by yourself and no one has to know but God. But there's something powerful about taking tangible steps. And so I want to encourage you to consider that and making that commitment before God. Let's pray together. Lord, I thank you for the example of Daniel. I thank you for the focus and perspective, for the tact, for the humility and integrity that he exhibited throughout his life, throughout his long life, in a prominent position of leadership. And God, I pray that as we look at his life, that we would be inspired and encouraged. And I know that when we see an example like this, it can be easy for us to feel convicted, embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. And God, I pray that by your Spirit you would allow us to understand your conviction is meant to make change. That we would not succumb to embarrassment, shame, and guilt, but that we would lay ourselves before you based on the things you lay on our hearts, and that your Holy Spirit would work in us to mold and shape us to become more like the people you've created us to be. So God, I ask that you would speak to our hearts and allow us to be responsive to what you have to say to us today. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.